You see, Erik, you were a client of Klaus's, right?
That's correct.
Good. Yes. And the discussions that you had during that time was actually what inspired Klaus to do this. Because you were telling him about how media has a tendency to tell us the bad things, that we think that the world is actually going to collapse tomorrow. And it's not quite like that, right? So please tell us how it is.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this fantastic evening and this very good initiative, a Local Act for Peace, and also for this occasion to talk a little bit about our research. So I'm the director of the Uppsala Conflict Data Program at Uppsala University, and we collect information about all wars and lesser armed conflicts, massacres, and so on globally. And this may seem like a little bit bizarre or extreme thing to study, perhaps, to count the number of people who perish in various horrible circumstances. But it's actually very important to have systematic information about these phenomena so that we can understand their causes and dynamics and conflict resolution. Next slide, please. So when we think about peace in the world today, I think that many of us, for good reasons, get an image in our minds of escalating utmost violence. And this is a graph that shows the developments in the last 10 years. It shows the number of people that we have counted in the Uppsala Conflict Data Program that were killed in what we call organized violence. That is wars and massacres and smaller conflicts. And indeed, what we see here is a dramatic increase. And in the last few years, there have been a few big conflicts that have contributed to this quite drastic picture. And this is what fills the pages of the newspapers and the reports on the news shows, on TV, and so on. It's all the time more violence and horrible things. Next slide, please. Go back one, please. So, and as you, I guess, we are all also aware that this, to a large extent, is driven by developments in and around Syria. So in this graph, the khaki-colored part represents the people who have perished in Syria and related conflicts. So it is because of the very unfortunate and very terrifying war in and around Syria that we have seen this increase in the last few years. And it is something that concerns us, and it should concern us. Why do we have these problems and the enormous numbers of refugees and internally displaced people and so on? But we need to have a bigger perspective. So if we look at not the last 10 years, as in this slide, but the last 25 years or 26 years, since the end of the Cold War, which is the next slide, please, you see a very different picture of the world. And in 1993-94, we see a very bad development in Central Africa and the genocide in Rwanda, which totally dominates everything else in terms of organized violence in the world in the post-Cold War era. As you can see, the level of killings in the Rwandan genocide dwarfs what is happening in Syria now. And we may think that genocides such as the one in Rwanda, they are so exceptional that we may think of them as different phenomena altogether. Maybe these genocides are so rare and so special that we should not compare. So we could remove the Rwandan genocide from the graph. And if we were to do that, we would see that the increase in the last few years is not particularly dramatic, and it's not exceptional. So next slide, please. So if we were to remove the Rwandan genocide from the picture, we should also remove some other lesser massacres, and then we keep what we call battle-related deaths. That is basically people killed in wars and armed conflict. As you can see, the graph is very similar to the previous one. So the blue color now represents people killed in wars and armed conflict in the post-Cold War period. And there is no clear trend. The last few years are quite bad, but not exceptionally so. But what if we compare the post-Cold War period to the period before that? Sometimes people have the impression that the Cold War period was a period of stability and order in the international system, and what followed has been chaos. But it's actually not true. Next, please. So this is what it looks like if we graph the number of people killed in wars and armed conflict since the end of the Second World War. And we have data from Uppsala Conflict Data Program to the right, the dark blue part, and then data from our colleagues in Norway on the left part in the Cold War period. As you can see, the Cold War period was much more violent than the post-Cold War period. We have in the late 1940s and early 1950s the Chinese Civil War. Very few people know about that. An enormous conflict, very destructive. Then, of course, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, the Soviet War in Afghanistan, and so on. So something very important has actually shifted with the end of the Cold War. The world has become more peaceful, despite the problems in the Middle East in the last few years. And as you can see, I have kept a marker for the Rwandan genocide, the gray shade there, to remind us that these are battle deaths, including civilians caught in crossfire and so on. But the extreme genocides are separate. And if we were to try to include them as well, we get an even more dramatic picture. Next slide, please. So there has not been a genocide even closely similar to even remotely similar to the one in Rwanda for more than 20 years. But these kind of enormous massacres happened shockingly regularly during the Cold War. And I have entered here some of the worst ones in Indonesia, in Pakistan, in Sudan, Nigeria, Cambodia, killing fields. So what this shows is that there is actually a downward trend since the end of the Second World War, and in particular since the end of the Cold War. The world is increasingly becoming more peaceful, not less peaceful, and that's very important. And of course, if I were to enter the Second World War, I would need to climb up on the roof, something like that, to include the staples, the bars. So we haven't had a comparable world war for 70 years. So this raises the question of why do we have a more peaceful world now? Next slide, please. And I argue that it's very important to try to understand what helps. If we all the time talk about how bad the situation is now, say in Syria or in parts of Nigeria and so on, maybe because we are rightly shocked and upset, then we tend to forget and overlook all the good things we can do for peace. So this is a picture from the United Nations Security Council. And we tend to have, many people have a pretty bad image of the United Nations. And we criticize the UN for being inefficient, for being corrupt, and sometimes peacekeepers commit atrocities or sexual violence, for example. And we should be concerned about that, and we should point out the problems. But we should not forget that the United Nations has contributed immensely to peace. Next slide, please. This slide shows the number of UN resolutions taken in the Security Council about issues having to do with peace and security. That's the blue bars. As you can see, around 1990, around the end of the Cold War, the UN exploded into activity, a totally unprecedented level of activity. The red bars represent the number of times that the Security Council veto has been used by the permanent members of the Security Council. And as you can see, it was much more common during the Cold War than in the more recent period. And we do know that there are conflicts between members of between the permanent members around how to deal with Syria, for example. But there's also many instances in which they can agree. Next slide, please. I don't know if you can see this, but the guy second from left is me in a very different haircut. So I'm a professor in peace and conflict research, but I was also a second lieutenant in the Swedish Armed Forces. This is in the mountains of Bosnia. I'm there with a Swedish colleague, and the man on the left is a Bosniak or Bosnian Muslim officer, and the man on the right is a Serbian officer. And we are out in the field there, demining, doing demining. So the thread that he's holding, the Serbian officer is holding, is a tripwire for a bounding mine. So this is not only about removing mines, but it's also about building confidence between former warring parties. So this picture represents peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is something that, of course, sometimes fails, but quite often succeeds. So it's a great way of promoting peace. Next slide, please. This graph shows the number of peacekeeping troops deployed under the UN. 1947 to 2014. And again, you can see that this has increased dramatically in more recent years. A very positive development, and it helps. Next slide, please. This picture symbolizes gender equality. Equality between men and women, which means increasing the status of women, since women have been oppressed in all societies. Why is that relevant? Well, this is not some politically correct wishful thinking, but this is based on hard research. Societies with more equality between men and women are more peaceful, and they are less violent in any way that you can measure it. This may partially be because women are more peaceful, and when they get more say in society, societies will be more peaceful. But I think the main explanation is that in societies in which there is a higher level of gender equality, both men and women have changed. And we do not anymore glorify war. And we do not accept violence as a way of dealing with conflict and establishing domination to the same extent as in those societies in which masculinity, manliness, is associated strongly with a warrior ID. Next slide, please. This shows the number of chief executives, that is presidents and prime ministers, in countries of the world who are female, who are women, and foreign ministers, since the foreign minister is considered to be the most prestigious minister besides the prime minister. So you can see that in recent years there has been a very positive development in many ways. Increased level of gender equality, which has contributed to peace. Of course, the world is still very unequal. Of course, most countries do not have a chief executive who is a woman or a female foreign minister, but it's undeniable that gender equality has improved, which contributes to peace. Next slide, please. And I argue that because our ideas about what it means to be a man and a woman, to be manly, has been de-linked from warrior roles. Because of that, we do not glorify war as much as we did in Europe only 100 years ago. This is a picture from the outbreak of the First World War. When the war started, people were streaming out in the streets celebrating. finally a big war in Europe. Now we have the chance to purify our nation and show our greatness and so on. But next picture, please. This has changed. Today in Europe, we increasingly see war as a last resort, as something bad that we may have to engage in, but we really don't like it and we don't glorify it. This is a picture from the largest demonstration ever, which was in 2003, when millions of people in several cities all over the world demonstrated against the impending war on Iraq. So this illustrates a tremendously important change that has taken place in our attitudes to war. So how we relate to each other, how we raise our children, how we deal with our youth, and how men and women treat each other is something which is very important for peace, and it's something that we all can relate to as local acts for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik Melander. Now we'll have